But first, I want to go back to something I mentioned last night because it was a feature of the closing arguments yesterday in the hotel quarantine inquiry. A lot of focus was on the Premier's chief bureaucrat, Chris Eccles, over an email offering ADF support from the PM's chief bureaucrat, all around April 8. The email that the Premier said last Friday, if he'd known about it, this is in the hotel quarantine inquiry, he might have operated hotel quarantine differently. Even though, as we know, 11 days earlier, the Premier said this.
Premier, in terms of keeping people in these quarantine hotel rooms, how will that work? Will there be guards at the door stopping people?
We'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force.
Right, so let's all drop the farce. The Premier didn't need any email to know about the ADF offer. Now let's put the Defence Force in all of this to one side for a moment. Why didn't Victoria Police step up and man hotel quarantine like police did in every other state? The Premier, again, back in that press conference in March 27, said, and I quote, "Private security, members of Victoria Police," and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his support of the ADF, the Australian Defence Force. So if the Premier wanted Victoria Police, why weren't they used? Well, Graham Ashton, at the time the Chief Commissioner of Police, tried to say in evidence at the hotel inquiry that he didn't have a view about whether or not private security or Victoria Police was used. But that's not true. On the same day that the National Cabinet agreed to establish mandatory hotel quarantine back on Friday, March 27, after the PM's announcement in Canberra, back in Melbourne, a couple of hours later, around 4:30 in the afternoon, there was a meeting of a whole range of senior bureaucrats, state and federal, to work out the nuts and bolts of how they'd set up the hotel quarantine system. We know who was there and what was said because the meeting was recorded and the full transcript given in evidence at the hotel inquiry. The head of Emergency Management Victoria, Andrew Crisp, chaired the meeting. It was the first meeting, in fact, of what later became known as Operation Cetera, the name given to the hotel quarantine program in Victoria. And at this meeting, this first meeting, from the outset, Victoria Police had already ruled themselves out of doing the hotel work. Now, that's a surprise, given the Premier of the state had just said, hadn't he, that they would be used in hotel quarantine. Here's the Premier again.
Premier, in terms of keeping people in these quarantine hotel rooms, how will that work? Will there be guards at the door stopping people?
We'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force.
Indeed, earlier on that same day, around 1 o'clock, before the PM had even announced the decisions of National Cabinet, Graham Ashton, the then police chief, was already hitting the phone and texting all and sundry to ensure Victoria Police was not put in charge of hotel quarantine. Forget what he told the hotel quarantine inquiry under oath Thursday 2 weeks ago. Ashton didn't want Victoria Police to do hotel quarantine, nor, am I told, did the powerful police union want their members babysitting, as I've been told it's been referred to, hotel travellers in hotel quarantine. Here's the text messages Ashton started to shoot off as soon as he got wind of the National Cabinet's decision back on the 27th of March. At 1:12 p.m, a message to the Australian Federal Police Commissioner Reece Kershaw trying to get Canberra's AFP to do the job, not Victoria Police. Before the PM had even announced publicly the decision to establish hotel quarantine in the early afternoon, and the PM spoke at around 2:30, there had already been a hastily convened discussion between Graham Ashton, the Police Minister Lisa Neville, and Crisp, the Emergency Management Chief. And their decision was that private security, not VicPol, would guard Victoria's quarantine hotels, with some mention of the ADF, which, as we know, never happened. Now, having worked for a Defence Minister back in the Howard years, one thing you can be sure of is that Defence loves a paper trail. In evidence to the hotel inquiry, there are pages and pages of daily Defence memos flying between the ADF personnel based inside Emergency Management Victoria in Melbourne, waiting for a Defence scale-up of all the operations that we now know never came, and the head of command in Canberra. They're called sit reps. They detail dozens and dozens of examples from the 27th of March, when the PM announced that the ADF would help with hotel quarantining, right the way through to May, where the ADF offered Victorian officials throughout that whole time help after help after help in terms of hotel quarantine work. And the repeated response back to Canberra was that, quote, Victoria Police had it all under control. Well, as we know now, 768 dead Victorians later, Victoria Police didn't have it under control. And in fact, Victoria Police was nowhere near hotel quarantine. It was private security guards. So why was Canberra told that VicPol had it all sorted? Why was the Police Minister, Lisa Neville, not taken to task by the Premier? After all, he said himself, didn't he, back in that press conference on March 27, that it would be private security, Victoria Police and the ADF. Where's the Premier asking Lisa Neville, well, Minister, what happened to the police that I promised back in March? Even if the Health Minister, Jenny Mikakos, was in charge of hotel quarantine, as the Premier says, it was never in her legal power as Health Minister to order Victoria Police to guard these hotels. Only the Police Minister, Lisa Neville, only the Police Minister could do that. And of course, only then with the agreement of the Police Chief, Graham Ashton. But it gets worse. Later on in June, after the disaster of the Black Lives Matter protests going ahead, when government ministers and officials already knew that the virus was leaking out of hotel quarantine, Andrew Crisp, again, Victoria's Emergency Management Commissioner, he realised that something had to be done. He knew the virus was out of control. He knew from regular briefings with the other states that what was happening in Victoria was not happening anywhere else. And he knew the difference between them and Victoria was the use of the Defence Force and police in hotel quarantine. And while he knew he couldn't do anything about the police, given the opposition of Neville and Ashton, don't forget, Crisp was in that private meeting back on the 27th of March when both of them ruled the police out. Under his powers as Emergency Management Commissioner, he could, however, this is Crisp, force the government's hand when it came to the military. And so he did. At 8:03 p.m. on Wednesday the 24th of June, Crisp formally sought 850 Defence Force personnel to urgently come to Victoria to take over hotel quarantine and do other tasks, such as ensure infected people stayed at home and help with contract tracing, which by then too was known to be riddled with failures. In under an hour, and that's lightning speed, let me tell you, these sort of government-to-government requests, at 8:52 p.m, Crisp had confirmation from Canberra that 850 troops were his. The next morning, Thursday the 25th of June, here's the Defence Minister, Linda Reynolds, confirming in a press release that the ADF were on the way. And then here she is on Radio 3AW's Neil Mitchell.
What power will the soldiers have in the streets of Melbourne?
Well, look, last night we received a request from the Victorian government in light, as you've said, of the state's increased confirmed COVID-19 cases. So we're looking to rapidly mobilise 1,000 ADF personnel to be on the job from tomorrow in support of Victoria. So we're looking at about 850 personnel providing planning advice and also hotel quarantine monitoring, and probably about another 200 to provide logistical and medical support for the public testing initiatives. Now, it's really important to note that the ADF have become very, very good at this. We've been helping nationally the COVID-19 response since February. So we're well trained and well practiced in all of the required health protocols. So we're coming to help.
As it would happen, another guest that morning was a none too happy Police Chief Graham Ashton.
You're comfortable with the Army coming in?
Yeah, well, at this stage they're not involved in any of the police side of things, so I think they're involved in the logistic planning. I think there's talk about the hotels and the security side of things.
Well, we're told they'll be going on some patrols with police.
We haven't been engaged on the police patrol side of things, so that would be news to me.
Are you comfortable with that sort of approach?
Well, I know Shane similarly would have a view that we've got that side of it covered, so I'm not sure if there were military assisting on patrols. I'm not sure what that would look like, but that's not something that's been discussed with us.
After this interview aired, we know the Police Minister shot off this text to Andrew Crisp, clearly angry that the ADF were on their way to Victoria. And she admitted in evidence at the hotel quarantine inquiry last Wednesday, the Police Minister, she admitted that she was cranky. Well, here's another of her text messages saying that sadly she was upset. Angry, cranky. Well, she was wrong. Sadly, even still, the Police Minister couldn't see the sense, even as infections were skyrocketing, of replacing untrained bouncers with the Army. She couldn't see the purpose of having the Army in hotel quarantine. Now, if Lisa Neville hadn't intervened, if the ADF had in fact arrived and done in Victoria what it did in every other state, Victoria tonight would unlikely be where it is, still in lockdown. And countless Victorian lives would not have been lost. But clearly, Lisa Neville won out here. I'm told the Victorian government didn't want to use Defence Force personnel because it would look like the Victorian government had failed on hotel quarantine, that they didn't like the optics of the Morrison government bailing them out. And even though Jenny Makakos wanted the ADF support, like Andrew Crisp, because they knew hotel quarantine was off the rails and sending Victoria into a second wave scenario, Daniel Andrews instead, I'm told, backed the Police Minister, Lisa Neville. So after the federal government had approved 850 ADF troops the night before and then announced that morning by the Defence Minister Linda Reynolds that they were on their way and strongly supported by the Health Minister Greg Hunt, came this email. At 12:31 p.m. on the Thursday, a humiliating backdown. Andrew Crisp forced to tell Canberra that the request for 850 troops was now withdrawn. Every Victorian who's lost someone they love has a right to know the truth of what happened, what should have happened, and why it happened. All Victorians who've lost their jobs or businesses deserve to know that too, as does every Australian taxpayer who'll be paying for the Victorian government's incompetence for years to come. Not the half-truths out of this underdone inquiry where not enough of the hard questions were asked, where they had no real access to documents, only what the Victorian government, what little they were prepared to give them, and no opportunity to compel witnesses to give evidence. Only a full Royal Commission can do that. What's happening now is a Premier is using the inquiry to scapegoat senior public servants. We saw that through the press today, in order to save his skin and that of his two ministers, Lisa Neville and Martin Pakula. This should not be the end of the matter. As far as I am concerned, let me tell you, it's just the start.